Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Beyond Broadway, The Pleasure and Promise of Musical Theater Across America, by Stacy Wolf, read by Romy Nordlinger. Introduction. The first musical I ever saw was The Music Man at the Burnbrae Dinner Theater in 1970 when I was 9 years old. My parents, my 7-year-old sister Allison, and I drove our dark blue country Squire station wagon 20 minutes from our snug townhouse in Columbia, Maryland, to a plain brown building next to a big parking lot at the end of a curvy country road off U.S. Route 29. We went to see the show because I was officially bitten by the musical theater bug. Like most Jewish middle-class children of the 1960s, I grew up listening to Broadway cast albums that played constantly in our house. My Fair Lady, Man of La Mancha, West Side Story, Funny Girl, Oklahoma, Camelot, and more. My grandmother serenaded me with Sunrise Sunset from Fiddler on the Roof whenever I slept over at her house. For my 4th birthday, my mother dressed me in a navy blue dress, black Mary Janes and white knee socks, and a navy cloth coat, and we went to Baltimore's Ambassador Theater to see the movie of Mary Poppins. We followed the same routine when I turned 6 for The Sound of Music, this time with my identically dressed little sister in tow. By 3rd grade, 1 year before our dinner theater sojourn, and the first-year girls were allowed to wear pants to public school, my mind was made up. I would be a Broadway star. Every day at lunch, while other girls were jumping rope or playing foursquare, my best friend, Marcy Pacino, and I made up dances to Broadway show tunes. We also called ourselves Melissa, that was me, and Elizabeth, that was Marcy, longing for worldly, sophisticated names and not the diminutive ones we'd been given. I made my stage debut that same year as Peter Pan in our class musical. We didn't have auditions, but when our teacher, Mrs. Rigby, asked who wanted to play Peter, my hand shot up before anyone else had the chance. Marcy played Wendy, and I got to wear a green felt costume that one of the mothers sewed, and my Aunt Judy was the accompanist. After it was over, my grandfather said to me, "You did great, and sang so loudly, and you were ad-libbing." I didn't know if ad-libbing was good or bad. I just wanted to be on stage. The summer after my Peter Pan debut, my sister and I went to sleepaway camp for 4 weeks. Camp Ramblewood, a non-Orthodox Jewish all-around camp in northeastern Maryland near the Chesapeake Bay. Camp was fine, even for a non-athletic child, and a passable swimmer, but the best part was getting to be in the musical, The Music Man. In fact, I don't recall playing any sports at camp. No memory of volleyball or softball, and only a vague recollection of passing the deep water test in the pool and learning how to dive. No, my clearest memories of summer camp are being in a dark, airless barn every day at rest hour after lunch, learning the music and choreography for 76 trombones. I was one of the youngest campers who tried out, and I wanted to play Amaryllis in the worst way. I didn't get that part. Now that I think of it, that was the first of countless shows in which I got cast, but not in the part I wanted. But I did land the role of Gracie Shin with a few speaking lines and the solo singing line. In March, I got a gray Mackinac in the big production number, Wells Fargo Wagon. I sang my line with gusto, having no idea whatsoever what a Mackinac was. I loved every minute of rehearsal, being around the big kids and learning music and choreography and going over it again and again until it was perfect. And then the night of the performance arrived, and the whole camp, kids, counselors, and staff, came to see the show. We performed in a cavernous multi-purpose space called the Big Top. The audience sat on the concrete floor. A few lights were strung up around the building, and we wore costumes assembled from whatever the theater counselors could cobble together. When my sister Allie and I were away at camp that summer, our parents moved our family from the city to the suburbs, from Baltimore, where our mother's family had lived for several generations, and where we were surrounded by grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles, to Columbia, Maryland, 30 minutes and a world away. Columbia was, and is, a planned utopian city built by the Rouse Company, a real estate developer, and our father's employer, on what had been farmland in Howard County, halfway between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. When Allie and I returned from camp to our new home in August, our parents had a surprise. We were going to see a production of The Music Man at the Burnbrae Dinner Theater. Because I had performed in the show at camp, they thought it would be fun to take us to see a professional production. I could hardly wait. Every moment of that night was magical for me, from getting dressed up to entering the small vestibule of the theater, whose walls were covered with black and white photos of past shows, to choosing among a vast array of foods on the buffet table, plus cakes, pies, and pudding for dessert, all topped with whipped cream. The show thrilled me, and I could barely breathe for the whole 2.5 hours. In part, I was affected because our table was right up against the stage, and I could almost touch the actors. And I was enthralled with the girl who played Amaryllis, Francine Applebaum, with her black corkscrew curls, shiny brown eyes, rosy cheeks, and turned-up nose. Most of all, because I had just performed in the show a few weeks prior, I could anticipate every line in the script, every note and every lyric in the songs, and I loved comparing each actor's interpretation, vocal inflections, and gestures with our production at camp. I noted that the boy who played Winthrop at Burnbrae used a much stronger, spit-filled lisp than David Gold, who was Winthrop at camp. The actor who played Marian at Burnbrae was an actual adult, and older, of course, and her soprano voice was thick, rich, and full of vibrato. Jeannie Kramer, the teenager who was Marian in Camp Ramblewood's production, also had a great voice, but her Marian seemed less dreamy and trusting, more suspicious of Harold Hill until the very end. Along with the cast and crew list and actors' bios, which I perused for days, the show's program advertised Saturday drama and dance classes for kids and teens held at the dinner theater. Our parents enrolled Allie and me, and as I entered 4th grade, I began what would be my routine through elementary, middle, and into high school. Saturdays at the theater. I met older kids and begged my parents to take me to see their high school productions of Guys and Dolls and community theater productions of Annie Get Your Gun. The drama teacher, Toby Orenstein, also directed some shows at Burnbrae, casting kids from her classes. And so I played one of the Martas in the dinner theater's production of The Sound of Music. Like many long-running shows with children, The Sound of Music was double cast, and one of the Siamese children in The King and I in full racial drag of dark pancake makeup, thickly lined eyes, and a black wig. I returned to camp the following summer, a year after The Music Man, and played one of the secretaries in How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. By my 11th birthday, I was a musical theater fanatic, an obsessed Broadway star wannabe, and had performed in or seen shows at most of the musical theater venues I visit in this book. I'd never been to New York or seen a Broadway show. As a national performance form, musical theater, an utterly American, unapologetically commercial, earnestly popular, and middle-brow form of art and entertainment, is ubiquitous and has astonishing staying power. Local productions of shows from Oklahoma to Thoroughly Modern Millie cut across economic, racial, and geographic divides, assuming the status of a national folk practice. Shows are handed down from one generation to the next, which is remarkable in a country of such diversity with so few common cultural experiences. Artists and audiences, both young and old, learn the Broadway canon and absorb the conventions of this distinctly American form of entertainment, and have a lot of fun doing so. Musical theater's liveness is anachronistic, almost primitive, a striking anomaly in the era of YouTube and new media platforms. Live performance's ephemerality. Every single performance is different, never to be repeated exactly, and taped performances don't capture the intense immediacy of being there as a performer or a spectator, means that musical theater lives locally and intimately, building community in its place of performance. Broadway, as a globally recognizable brand, maintains its status as musical theater's birthplace, but the form only persists in American culture thanks to local performances. Or put another way, when most people think about musicals, they imagine Broadway, New York City, bright lights and big city. But in fact, the lifeblood of the musical is local, in productions at high schools and community theaters, after-school programs and summer camps and dinner theaters. Local musical theater is an underexamined, undervalued practice that touches millions of people's lives. Beyond Broadway illustrates the widespread presence and persistence of musical theater in U.S. culture, examining it not as an object or a cultural artifact, as much musical theater scholarship does, but as a social practice, a doing, a live, visceral experience of creating, watching, listening. Moreover, local musical theater sustains the Broadway musical. Were it not for local musical theater, in fact, there would be no Broadway musical. Why? First, there would be no artists, as virtually every professional actor, director, choreographer, and designer began in a high school musical, a summer camp show, or a community theater production in their hometown. Second, there would be no Broadway audiences because a vast number of spectators go to see musicals on Broadway that they already know from seeing or performing in them at home. Third, there would be no Broadway repertoire because licensing companies gain considerable profit through non-equity and amateur licensing, a full 50% of their gross. Even a musical that financially fails on Broadway, which 80% do, can make back its investment through years of local productions at community theaters and high schools. But local musical theater is also an activity to be valued in and of itself for its contribution to individuals' lives and their communities. As Tim McDonald, president of iTheatrics, a company that develops short adaptations of Broadway musicals for kids, said, "I estimate that 99% of Americans will never see a show on Broadway. Their Broadway experience takes place in school theaters, community theaters, and regional theaters, in inner-city schools, suburban schools, and rural schools. These folks have a great time putting on a musical for their community." The Broadway musical truly lives beyond Broadway. Why does local musical theater flourish in this country? Why do people continue to find this activity pleasurable? Why do they passionately engage in such an old-fashioned and slow artistic practice, one that requires intense person-to-person collaboration? And why do audiences still flock to musicals in the towns where they live? What does local musical theater do? Beyond Broadway answers these questions by taking a journey that crisscrosses America, stopping at elementary schools, a middle school festival, after-school programs, high schools, summer camps, state park outdoor theaters, community theaters, and dinner theaters. We go to California and Colorado, Maine and Michigan, Texas and Tennessee. What we find on this expedition is the ordinary abundance and extraordinary longevity of the musical as a thriving activity in U.S. society that touches millions of people's lives. This book shows how a middle-class Jewish girl could imagine herself as a Broadway star without ever having been there. The Tony Awards and Broadway. Near the beginning of the 72nd Annual Tony Awards in June 2018, co-hosts Sarah Bareilles and Josh Groban waxed poetic, delighted to be hosting the Tonys. "It's a dream come true for the both of us," said Bareilles. "Because we're both theater kids. In fact, here's the proof," as she gestured upstage toward the big screen behind them that displayed a photo of her as a teenager. "That," she said, drawing out the word with a grin, "is me playing Fern in Charlotte's Web in Humboldt County when I was 14. Chortles from the Radio City Music Hall audience. The next photo appeared on the screen of a little boy in some kind of pajama-looking animal costume with a hood and small ears sewn on, and Groban chimed in, "And here I am at age 9, playing Mr. Mistopheles in my backyard production of Cats." The audience roared with laughter, and Groban looked around the theater and shouted good-naturedly, "Where is Andrew Lloyd Webber? Where are you?" The camera panned to Lloyd Webber in the audience, looking bemused. "Eat your heart out, sir, eat your heart out," chuckled Groban. And the audience, thousands in the theater, and more than 6.3 million at home, continued to laugh with warm, knowing appreciation. But this trip down memory lane was only a pretext for the real event. "We know there are a lot of you out there who have photos of yourselves in school plays or community theater," Bareilles said, and Groban went on. "We want you to go to Twitter and Instagram and post these photos using hashtag #TonyDreaming. We want to celebrate you on the Tonys tonight." Bareilles concluded their spiel. "And throughout the show, we'll see photos of the presenters in some of their very first roles." The fans answered the call, and thousands posted photos of themselves on stage in Grease, West Side Story, and Annie, to name a few, and backstage gathered in affectionate clumps of friends, their arms draped around each other. They posted sweet captions like, "Dreams are the result of hard work," and "Theater will forever have my heart." On Tony Night, Broadway's most glamorous, most New York-focused evening, the producers paid homage to local and amateur theater and to professional artists' humble roots. The show provided the evidence that all actors start out in local productions and acknowledged that Broadway depends on local, mostly amateur theater makers. The gesture, surely an attempt to increase ratings, which may have worked. Viewership was up 1/10 of a point over 2017, explicitly linked New York with the rest of the country, the professional with the amateur, Broadway with schools and community theaters. The Tonys recognized Broadway musical theater as U.S. popular culture from coast to coast. This was Broadway looking to the local. How does the local look back? How do local musical theaters converse with Broadway? First, by way of the repertoire. Across the United States, community theaters, dinner theaters, after-school programs, and the other venues discussed in this book perform the repertoire of musicals that originate on Broadway. Local theater makers eagerly await the release of licensing rights for new and popular shows and jump at the chance to do a show as soon as it's released. As we will see in Chapter 8, for example, the competition among Colorado dinner theaters to premiere a show in the region is fierce. Local theaters support and legitimate the Broadway repertoire, too. As Broadway producers figured out that turning a profit on Broadway is against all odds, but making money through the licensing of local productions across the United States is a real possibility. Shows are increasingly being written and developed for widespread productions. Disney's Newsies, for example, was never intended to enjoy a long Broadway run. The musical just needed to play in New York long enough to earn the As Seen on Broadway imprimatur. For Disney, scores of local productions of Newsies were always the goal. In this way, local musical theater more and more inspires the repertoire. Second, The local looks to Broadway because original canonical performances haunt all future productions across the United States. Well-known, popular, or iconic performances, which abound in musical theater, leave a trace. It could be the original actor, like Patti LuPone as Evita, Chita Rivera as Anita in West Side Story, or Sarah Brightman as Christine in The Phantom of the Opera. As theater scholar Marvin Carlson writes, audiences are haunted by the memory of that interpretation, and all actors performing the role must contend with the cultural ghost of the great originator. And not only actors, original production concepts. Michael Bennett's single line across the stage in a chorus line, choreography, Jerome Robbins's bottle dance in Fiddler on the Roof, or set design, John Napier's huge interlocking, rotating scaffold as barricade in Les Miserables, also create cultural memories. A production team, director, musical director, choreographer, designers, actors, almost always knows previous versions of the show they're doing through the cast album, the Broadway production, a movie version, or YouTube clips, so they must decide whether to try to emulate the original, to work against it, or to try to pretend it's not there. The ghosts of Broadway can't be ignored. Third, local theater makers respond to the symbolic weight of Broadway as an aesthetic benchmark. Whether or not local artists or audiences have been to New York City's Broadway, the idea of Broadway suffuses their expectations and judgments. It's as good as Broadway is the highest compliment paid to any performer or production anywhere. Finally, Broadway is a real place, a street and a neighborhood, the mecca of musical theater. This Broadway holds power for some, none at all for others, and its theater offerings are exorbitantly expensive for everyone and inaccessible to many. In spite of astronomical and ever-rising ticket prices for a Broadway show on Broadway, plus the expense of traveling to New York, the presence of musical theater is increasing and everywhere. Broadway may be out of reach, but Broadway musical theater is not. Where we are, 1. Time and musicals in the 2010s. It's the evening of January 20th, 2006, and 7.7 million people across the United States are sitting in front of their televisions, watching the Disney movie High School Musical, already tapping their toes and humming along to "We're All in This Together." High School Musical would become a blockbuster, the most successful Disney Channel original movie ever produced. It would also launch a new era for Broadway-style musicals, exponentially expanding their visibility and popularity. The 2010s, a decade of intense musical theater enthusiasm and activity, provides the context for this book. While local musical theater at community theaters, high schools, and summer camps existed and quietly flourished since the early 20th century, renewed interest in the form skyrocketed in the early 21st century. Once an activity stereotyped as only for girls and gay-seeming proto-gay boys, participation in musical theater became, in many settings, as acceptable as playing sports. The terrain shifted with High School Musical, with its infectious score, relatable high school setting, and, most importantly, enormously appealing straight white male protagonist, the handsome star athlete, played by heartthrob Zac Efron, who's equally drawn to musical theater performances as to basketball. His romance with the studious new girl in town, starlet Vanessa Hudgens, blossoms in the school's auditorium as the two decide to audition for the High School Musical. After its record-breaking premiere, the TV movie drew 6.1 million more viewers when Disney rebroadcast it the following night. The soundtrack was #1 on the Billboard charts for 2 weeks and went quadruple platinum. Within 6 months, Disney created a stage version of High School Musical, which still enjoys thousands of productions each year. This story of the athlete who also loves to sing and dance wasn't unheard of in real life, but High School Musical blew open the secret and fully masculinized the desire to perform. Just prior to High School Musical, though, the TV competition show American Idol, 2002 through 16, 2017 through 18, transformed television, stardom, and musical performance, followed by Dancing with the Stars, debuted 2005, and So You Think You Can Dance, debuted 2005. These shows also paved the way for musical theater's widespread popularity. According to John Coblin in the New York Times, American Idol not only established itself as rating powerhouse, but spawned a series of amateur singing competitions that strove to duplicate its success. While not about musical theater per se, the competitive reality shows valued musical theater-style performance by people of all genders, races, and types, and made stardom seem accessible to anyone. Other narrative TV series like Fox's Glee, which ran for 6 seasons, 2009 through 15, and NBC's Smash, 2012 through 13, and Rise, 10 episodes in 2018, also featured characters across identities who found joy in performance as show tunes transformed the school's losers into show choir winners. Episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 1996 through 2003, and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, 2015 through 18, also relied on tropes and techniques of musicals. Truer to the musical theater repertoire, live televised revivals of classic musicals, including The Sound of Music Live, 2013, The Wiz Live, 2015, and Grease Live, 2016, brought old shows onto people's screens and into their homes. Movie musicals also proliferated in the 2010s, including film adaptations of the Broadway hits Les Miserables, 2012, and Into the Woods, 2014. The original musical La La Land, 2016, which won 6 Academy Awards. The Disney animated Moana, 2016. And, of course, the monster hit Frozen, 2013, which sold 1.3 billion in tickets worldwide. Rob Marshall's 2002 film adaptation of Kander and Ebb's Chicago, Tim Burton's 2007 film of Sondheim's Sweeney Todd, and Phillida Lloyd's 2008 version of ABBA's Mamma Mia foreshadowed this trend. In 2017, on the heels of the success of La La Land, roughly 20 musicals were in the works in studios, including original musicals. The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman, released in 2017, and adaptations of Broadway shows, Wicked. Music has a way of getting inside all of us and lifting us up, said theater, television, and film producer Mark Platt. New York Times writer Brooks Barnes explained that there is an inherent entertainment proposition in musicals, a heightened emotional experience that people go to the movies to find. These mass media events returned musical theater to the entertainment mainstream, inculcating millions of children, teens, and adults into the pleasures of a form that many critics said was dead by the mid-1960s. Though the live staged Broadway musical was reinvigorated in the 1980s with the influx of UK-born mega-musicals like Cats, 1982, and Phantom of the Opera, 1988, the televisual performances of the early 21st century could take advantage of the explosive growth of YouTube as an entertainment and communication platform. These shows wove musicals into the daily lives of millions on a scale unlike anything since the golden age of the Broadway musical in the 1940s and 1950s, when cast albums served a similarly pleasurable infectious function and held a similarly pleasurable inculcating power. Even by 2010, the start of the decade, New York Times writer David Camp identified the Glee generation. In the 4 years since the airing of High School Musical, he wrote, "The musical theater idiom has regained its currency and is enjoying what may be its great..."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?